Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp. He's an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and he's also a lecturer at the University Roma Tre in Rome. Welcome, Dr. Kamp.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. You have recently published an article where you say that Germany's nuclear IQ is very low. And if one reads your article, one sees that Germany has very low understanding on what is nuclear weapons, what is nuclear deterrence. And this low understanding is being spread, as I at least understood your text, in both the population and among many people whose work is to protect our country in the Bundeswehr. How bad is the situation?
Well, first, the situation is fairly normal for non-nuclear NATO countries. Of course, the US, the UK, France have a different IQ because it's their daily business. But after the end of the Cold War, when before we were all occupied with nuclear deterrence, particularly Germany, the divided Germany, which was the old front state, then after this, there was the general perception in NATO, not only in Germany, but particularly in Germany, that we are circumvented by friends, which means things like deterrence, defense, nuclear weapons just went to the back burner. And since particularly Germany was always nuclear critical, particularly nuclear discussions went on the back burner. So in the last 30 years, maybe at least, hardly anyone dealt with them. And then it's a normal process that you lose expertise. Members of the parliament don't know because they didn't have to take care of it in recent years. Politicians don't know. Journalists don't know. The academic area doesn't know. So now we have to restart this entire process to come back to the capacity to discuss on nuclear deterrence.
What absolutely shocked me when I read that there are only 2 people in the whole Germany's Ministry of Defense who deal directly with the topics of nuclear weapons. Is it normal for non-nuclear states?
Well, I think so. I mean, I'm living here in Italy now. I was before working at the German Ministry of Defense, and before I was the president of our Federal Academy for Security Policy. So I know a little bit the inside bubble of Berlin. Here in Italy, it's even worse. Italy doesn't even officially admit that it has nuclear weapons on its soil, something which we in Germany do. So it is normal that with scarce resources in the ministry, where you have a host of other topics, NATO, terrorism, you name it, that the people who are dealing with this niche issue, and it was a niche issue for many years, is not a surprise. If you just imagine that NATO's nuclear planning group, so the institution that deals with nuclear weapons, it didn't meet for a couple of years, if not decades. And if it met, it just showed up for 5 minutes and they went. So it's a normal process following the fact that deterrence was just in the perception. Of course, Poland or the Baltic Republic, all republics always saw differently, but the classical Western NATO countries follow just the demand and supply principle. And then it is that only 1 or 2 guys in the ministry deal with nuclear weapons.
But that sounds like a bit counterintuitive. We know that the German public is deeply concerned with the topic of nuclear weapons. If you watch German TV, you see the talk shows, and the topic of nukes, the Russian nukes, American nukes, is always on the table. You see all the demonstrations of German population since 1970s against nuclear weapons, and in all Easter pro-peace demonstration, you will find a lot of slogans and a lot of posters addressing the topic of nukes. Is it something what comes from the broad public against the politics, or is it what comes from top to bottom, from the politics to the public?
Well, even this changed significantly. You are absolutely right. We were a deeply, and we still are maybe, a deeply anti-nuclear society. And we had the major nuclear protests in the late 70s and early 80s. and throughout the late 80s, even to the 90s. But after all these nuclear disarmament steps, and if you imagine that in the Cold War, Germany had about 7,000 nuclear weapons on its soil. Today we have plus minus 100. So after this, after the perception, wall is down, Soviet Union has dissolved, we are encircled by friends, NATO has enlarged, also the nuclear protests went down significantly. We still have protests against civil use of nuclear energy, but it was only a minority. I mean, we have these famous Easter marches, where on Easter the peace movement starts marching. In the last 10 years, you had a few hundred people marching back and forth. So once again, the topic was there, but it just fell behind. So even the nuclear protest lost significantly steam because there was nothing to protest against. And all this changed, by the way, with the attack. It changed a little bit already in 2014, but it significantly changed with the attack, with Moscow's attack on Ukraine. And then you have all these old reflects coming up by saying, wow, we have to be careful in supporting Ukraine not to cause a nuclear escalation. Okay, but still a debate on nuclear deterrence was not necessary because it was a fixed principle. Okay, the weapons were there. We said, okay, they are somewhere there for deterrence, and no one cared about how and why. And now we are back in an era where we have to discuss facts. Do we deter only Russia or Russia and China? What about Belarus? What if are the current weapons in NATO, are they sufficient? Yes or no? Are they stationed in Germany? Does this make sense? Or would it make more sense to put them to, let's say, Poland or the Baltic republics? What happens if Ukraine changes, if Ukraine joins one day NATO? So a huge number of questions come up, which now require expertise. We didn't have these questions, and that's why no one, neither the public nor the politicians, had to care about them.
That is a very important question. We will dive deeper into this question later in the interview. But before we do it, don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel so you will never miss interviews like this. Dr. Kamp, you have mentioned already this need of the politics to think deeper about the question of nuclear deterrence and practical steps which are needed to deter our adversaries. But with the current political leadership, we know that their past is on the field of disarmament and anti-nuclear movement. We know that many of the politicians of today were in the peace movement or anti-NATO movement, and even Chancellor Scholz went to the GDR to promote understanding, and he wanted back then to reduce Germany's participation in NATO. How does this affect their steps today?
Well, this is why what we call Zeitenwende is so fundamental and so really revolutionary. So I'm neither one of the Greens nor one of the Social Democrats. Actually, I was always on the other side of the barricade, but I worked in the last years throughout the Zeitenwende time in the Ministry of Defense, and seeing this fundamental change and the painful steps the Green politicians who years and decades ago demonstrated against the nuclear weapons had to do now to support nuclear deterrence, all the critical voices among the Social Democrats. So this Zeitenwende has been, strange enough, put forward by security critical or military critical or nuclear critical part in Germany. This is why, by the way, it's apparently working, and it has in the meantime also led to a change in the heads of the people and in the heads and minds. So if you, for instance, imagine that at the NATO summit, it has been agreed upon to put the US conventional missiles on German soil from 2026 on, no protest, no people, chaining themselves to the military depots. So you see that this Zeitenwende has led to a complete redefinition of our standing on security policy. And this is why it is so surprising, and it has been done indeed by people who were on the anti-nuclear side. And our foreign minister, Baerbock, is now strongly supporting deterrence. Many Green politicians know the types of different tanks better than you and I. So it is really a fundamental change in this country, which I hadn't imagined, actually, when I heard about this at the February 27, 2022, when Chancellor Scholz gave his famous Zeitenwende speech.
When we look at the question of nuclear deterrence and usage of nuclear weapons and the principles of how it works, Russia has demonstrated that they know very well how to reflectively control at least some of German steps on the foreign policy. And all the argumentations why we do not send weapons to Ukraine, starting from Mordor IVs over Leopard 2 tanks and now Taurus missiles, they end, after all, in the argumentation that it will be a red line for Russia and Russia may use nukes. Does it make Germany ultimately vulnerable against Russian nuclear blackmail?
The interesting thing is that, of course, Russia tries to instrumentalize nuclear deterrence. It partly worked in the sense of without nuclear weapons, Russia would not have dared to start the attack at all. If you would imagine for a second, counterfactual, that Russia would not have nuclear weapons, NATO or the US or whoever would have long have intervened and would have decisively defeated Russia. So the nuclear umbrella, Russia's nuclear umbrella, enabled Russia to start this military aggression at all. Since then, though, the nuclear threats were not that successful because it did not keep the West from supporting Ukraine significantly. Germany has become the second largest supporter. The famous non-military, pacifist, non-nuclear Germany has become the second largest supporter of Ukraine militarily and with civilian means. So apparently the Russian threat of nuclear escalation did not keep the German government from supporting Ukraine. Yes, Putin and others have defined red lines time and again, but these red lines have been crossed and nothing happened. So Russia threatened, for instance, to attack, not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional means, the choke points in Poland, where all the support for Ukraine goes through. Nothing happened. Is this a guarantee that they will never use nuclear weapons? No, it's not, unfortunately. So the threat of, or the possibility of a nuclear escalation is there. I personally regard it very unlikely, but that doesn't mean that Putin, if he feels himself painted in a corner, thinks the same way. But at the end of the day, Russia's nuclear threats were much less successful as they believed they were. So this, by the way, has, on the one hand, it has increased the value of nuclear weapons. It made the war possible. On the other hand, it decreased the value of nuclear weapons because you cannot keep alliances from doing what they want to do.
Indeed, and we have seen that even on the polls in Ukraine, over 80% of Ukrainians say they would be ready to fight further, even if Russia uses nukes, even on a city in Ukraine, saying Russia has already did to Ukrainian city like Bakhmut or Avdiivka or others, damages comparable to nuclear strike. So it doesn't change anything for Ukrainians, but of course it changed a lot for the Western nations, which remember the terror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and were raised in this understanding that nuclear war is the worst kind of war. But talking about nuclear deterrence in a larger term than Germany only, we know that the presidential elections in the US are still have not been decided. And in a case when the US presence in Europe, military presence, will reduce or will disappear at all, can we imagine that the only EU nuclear power, France, can extend its nuclear guarantees, security guarantees for other nations, for example, for Germany?
Well, this is one reason why it's a proof why our nuclear IQ was so low when Donald Trump a couple of months ago made this appalling statement that he would not defend the Eastern Europeans, he would leave them to the Russians. The immediate reaction in Germany was, even among politicians, to say, well, then France has to do it. What they underestimate that France rejects the idea of extended nuclear deterrence. Extended nuclear deterrence means not only two nuclear powers deter themselves, but a nuclear power extends its nuclear umbrella to its ally. The problem of extended deterrence is it has problems of credibility. Do we Germans believe that the Americans will really risk New York or San Francisco of a counterstrike to protect Berlin or Warsaw or anyone else? This is a basic dilemma of extended nuclear deterrence, which you cannot answer. You can only prove it in a war, and I don't want to find it out. France made a logical decision by saying, we don't believe this. We just don't believe in this concept. That's why we need own nuclear weapons, and our nuclear weapons are national weapons. They are for our nation. So this is why a country that in principle, and the argumentation of France is not wrong, it's a very logical one, a country that rejects by definition extended deterrence cannot extend deterrence to other countries. Okay? At the same time, this entire deterrence thing is a very ambiguous thing. Deterrence is not clearly defined. You don't switch it off and on like the light in the room, okay? If the Americans are no longer there, no deterrence. If the French say no, no deterrence, because deterrence works with ambiguity. And ambiguity, particularly in the head of those who want to attack. This means if Donald Trump gets elected and tomorrow says, I give a damn for these Europeans, I will not protect them anymore. This doesn't mean that deterrence is completely gone overnight. We have France as a nuclear power, yes, rejecting nuclear deterrence, but you don't know what they do in a real case. We have the UK as a nuclear power. We have even the US still there. And Donald Trump might change his mind by saying, what? Putin attacked Poland, I will bomb the hell out of him. So particularly if you have a president who is, how to say it nicely, a little bit difficult in his mental conditions, this even complicates the situation for the attacker even more, because the entire principle of deterrence is, I can inflict to you as the attacker more damage than any gain you might hope for. And you don't want to find it out. You don't want to try it out. Yes, maybe you are right. I will not do anything. But if I should react, you will suffer tremendous damage. And in this mutual ambiguity we are living, and there France is only one element in this business.
And what about the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, another nuclear power within NATO? They don't have a lot of nukes, and Russians constantly threat them with attack on their nuclear submarine naval base openly, like on Russian state TV. But they are a nuclear power. Can they extend their nuclear deterrence to non-nuclear states in the NATO?
So all NATO documents, the nuclear wording in all recent nuclear documents says two things. First, NATO's nuclear deterrence is primarily done by the United States. In addition, second point, NATO has two other nuclear powers, France and the UK, which are independent centers of decision. And this complicates any calculation of an attacker. I think this is the official line, and this line is fairly comprehensive. And it leaves everything, or it is as clear as it can be in the nuclear business, and it leaves a lot of guessing for any attacker on what the UK will do, what France will do. To be serious, I mean, if the Russians are marching forward, let's say, and they have rolled over Poland and they have rolled over Germany, France is not sitting back and saying, look, I don't do anything before they cross our borders. So in a war, the situation might be difficult. I don't want to find it out, by the way, but I think that with these with the three centers of decision, independent centers of decision, NATO is very well off with respect to deterrence. And the sheer fact that Russia did not dare to attack a NATO country, it did not dare to even cut a small slice out of the Baltic countries, which was always a concern, shows that Putin is very well aware of the risk of fooling around with NATO, and he doesn't do it so far.
Speaking about the different approaches among the broad public to the topic, so we have already discussed that Germany and Italy, I guess some other non-nuclear nations have very low nuclear IQ. What about nuclear IQ among the French and the British population?
Well, these are both nuclear powers, which means the nuclear is much more in the public discussion. Nuclear weapons cost money. So you have a debate on, is this worth yes or no? Do we need new ones? The military is discussing for all the nuclear stuff, we could buy this and this and that. The people are discussing by being nuclear power, we become a nuclear target. So the entire ball game is completely different than in the non-nuclear countries. So this is why they, by definition, have more. Look at the number of books, for instance, published in the UK, in France on nuclear, and the number of books in Germany, in Holland, in you name it, Portugal, Spain, wherever, it's a small fraction. Normal, rightly so. So the reason why we have to come up with a new nuclear IQ is because if you see in the Washington Summit Declaration for the first time, and also there I was surprised that no one realized this, is a sentence written saying NATO might have to consider nuclear modernization. This term hasn't been mentioned in the last 35 years. And if we talk about nuclear modernization, then the question is, what does it mean? And then all the countries have to make up their mind, their own position. What do we Germans think about it? Do we want them on our soil, and so on and so forth? So all the questions are coming up by force, so to speak, by NATO's decisions, by our all decisions, is something that forces us to discuss this again. And if you want to discuss, you have to know what you're talking about.
Indeed, and this modernization doesn't mean new means of delivery of nuclear weapons or new nuclear warheads. If you have new nuclear warheads, you need to test them. You have prohibition of testing. It's a complex issue of international relations.
No, you don't need to test. First, we have means of delivery. We all have the new F-35. We have a small number of nuclear bombs. What you can do is you can either increase, not I'm saying that this is good or bad, but an option is to increase the number of nuclear bombs in Europe. They have a couple of them lying in the US. They have been withdrawn there. There's one option. The other option is that you bring new nuclear weapons. We can talk about standoff missiles. We can talk about cruise missiles. That's a completely different ballgame. For this, you don't have to test because all the warheads you put on these devices, on the cruise missiles, on the missiles, are all tested. They are all there. They are functioning. They are basically lying around in their depots, nicely maintained, so you don't have to test. No.
And this, of course, will mean that we'll have larger nuclear arsenal, which we can use in a case, and that comes a question if we need it or not. But talking about an elephant in the room, Russia, which is, of course, one of the most important adversaries, the largest or one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. We don't know how capable it is. We all hope that it's as capable as Russian army. That means less capable than it was advertised, but we don't want to test it. Can we say that in Russia, the situation is quite different to Germany and the opposite to Germany? Very high acceptation of nuclear weapons, very high willingness to brag with them, and practically no fear among the population about the nukes. I'm not talking about the political leadership who can calculate the risks, but if you ask the normal Russian, what do they think about dropping a nuclear bomb on Kiev or London or Washington, they will say, why not?
Well, first, there are two things which are important. The first one is that Russia, also the Soviet Union before, traditionally has a different view on nuclear weapons, which is not more right or more wrong, but it's just different. In our case, in the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, so after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we realized nuclear is something different. Initially, when nuclear weapons came up in the 1950s, the general perception was, wow, they are nice, they are powerful, they cost less, so it was called just another weapon. Or as the Americans were saying, they provide more bang for the buck, or more rubble for the ruble. And only in the nuclear crisis we had, particularly in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we all looked into the abyss and say, my goodness, if this thing goes wrong, we are all dead. This changed the Western perception of nuclear weapons. So for us, they are a class in its own. We have the conventional weapons, and then comes a gap, and then comes nuclear. In Russia, they see nuclear weapons as one element in a seamless chain of means of statecraft. Diplomacy, military, conventional, nuclear. Which means you can use them according to your individual needs. There is not this fundamental gap between conventional and nuclear. This is why in all Russian exercises, they're much earlier and much easier include nuclear use in the exercises. There is less conceptual resistance against this, point one. Point two is that Russia, particularly under Putin, particularly after attacking Ukraine, banks on the card of nationalism, of national grandeur, a little bit like the French did many years before. So we are, and of course, it covers all the deficiencies of Russia. Russia economically is going down the drain in the long run because they have only two products on the world market, energy and weapons, and both are not selling that well anymore. There's nothing else. They don't even produce a car that you can sell on the world market. So you have to put your grandeur on either your Russianship, on your nation, and then on the images, on the symbols of your size, of your importance. And this is nuclear. So this is why, and you have the third element that the West, particularly the US, are responsible for all evil in the world. We poor Germans and French, we are only the puppets at the string of the Americans who are just trying to govern the world. And then, of course, if you attack basically like the great Satan in the radical Islamic world, this is why you have these strange wordings in Russia. I'm fairly sure, though, and here I speculate, that the leadership, and particularly the military leadership, is very well aware of the dangers of nuclear weapons, and this is why they are not using, or it's not likely that they will use them so easily.
Will we see, with all this development and with the proliferation of the nukes, will we see a usage of a nuclear device within the next decades?
The honest answer is I don't know. It can happen with Russia every day. As I said, that I believe that it would be not logical for Putin doesn't mean that he believes the same. He did already a stupid thing, and so he might do it again. I think the US have very clearly communicated what would happen if Russia should use a nuclear weapon, and the consequences for Russia would be devastating. That was clearly communicated. Whether other countries, North Korea, potentially Iran, would use nuclear weapons, I don't know. I realize, though, that those countries who possess nuclear weapons act with them in a responsible way. In the 90s, Pakistan and India became nuclear weapon states. In the late 90s, they even fought a conventional war against each other, the Kargil War, and they did not refer to the nuclear capacity. So even they apparently realized it is a Pandora's box which you better leave closed. Whether anyone is ready to open it, I don't know. It's pure speculation. I hope not, but no predictions possible.
And indeed, like many countries acted very responsibly, very responsible. For example, Ukraine has abandoned its nukes in exchange for security guarantees. They believe they will work, and now they know they didn't. But the abandon of the nukes has been done, and it's a question, of course, if other nations under the current conditions would say, if we have nuke, we better abandon them, or we will possess them. It is, of course, an open question. We have talked to Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp, who is an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and he's also a lecturer at the University Roma Tre in Rome. Thank you, Dr. Kamp, for this interview.
My pleasure.
And don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like this.